It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. And you can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting if you reach out to me at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. You can find the archives for free at Spreaker.com. Every Friday night I do a live show there at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And if you go there and you look up Mike King, and we had him on the show about Deceived, an investigative memoir of the Zion Society cult. That's one of his books. Another book, though, is She Knew No Fear, the true story of pioneer Jane McKechnie, Walton's incredible journey and untimely death. She's like a true crime author, but also a podcaster that's kind of just blown up out of nowhere. He's got like 200,000 followers on this podcast on YouTube, Profiling Evil. And you go to his website, profilingevil.com. It has a link to the books. You get autographed books, a link to the podcast, and all the great work that Mike King is doing. Mr. Mike King, are you there?
Hey, I am. What a great opportunity to be back with you, Ed. It's been a while. How are you?
Yeah, you're such a likable guy, man. I don't know how you do it. Ed's always so cranky. That's what I'm mad about. But not Mike King. Isn't it? Tell me this. Remind the audience, who is Mike King?
What? Well, you know what? I spent a law enforcement career, and I think that kind of is what defined me. I started out as a property crimes investigator, was a street cop, obviously, and was doing a lot of sting operations on stolen cars. And one day I ended up stumbling into this Zion Society cult, which was a group that was sexually assaulting children. We've talked about it before on your show. And from there, that kind of changed my whole trajectory. I ended up going to the FBI and being trained by FBI profilers in this kind of art and science of profiling, and started to apply behavior to criminal cases, and spent the remainder of my career investigating serial predators and following cults. And when I retired in 2004, just after the 2002 Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City, I was given an opportunity to go to work for a company called Esri out in Los Angeles, and I spent 17 and a half years there working with law enforcement all around the world on intelligence gathering, use of geography or GIS mapping in their crime analysis process, the 911 process, and just anything hopefully having to do with public safety. So it's been just an incredibly rich career.
And now you're taking off on this podcasting, huh?
You know, that is crazy. My kids talked me into doing a couple of little videos on YouTube during COVID. They said, hey, we're kind of tired of hearing your old war stories. Why don't you just yap about one? I jumped on, I shared it, and somehow it resonated. And from there, Profiling Evil has grown. I think we have about 17 or 18 million views on the video podcast side. Our audio podcast is going gangbusters. And because of that, I've ended up doing work on the Dr. Phil show and NewsNation. I just finished season 2 with Lawrence Fishburne on A&E's History's Greatest Mysteries. And just been having a blast. Last week I was in New York City filming a new murder mystery for Fox a documentary that will come out. And gosh, I don't know. I just kind of an old guy with I guess some things that still seem relevant from time to time.
Well, it sounds great, man. Sounds like you got a lot of energy still left in you there, man. God bless you. So I'm on the profilingevil.com mailing list, and I noticed you caught my interest recently because you're covering that Robert Tellis case in Las Vegas.
What a crazy case. And I know you've got some connection in there, but the thing that caught my eye early on was kind of the whole guise that Tellis or Teus, however he likes to say, and I guess he says it either way, but the whole guise that he put forth in planning and then executing this homicide. But even today, Ed, I don't know about you, but I'm scratching my head thinking, why the goofy outfit that clearly made this guy stand out? And I think it kind of leads toward all of the disorganization that was going on in his mind as he put this thing together, and how fueled with anger he was.
Well, you must have a lot of experience, dealing in courts and stuff. And some of these wacky defendants, man, they got this whole plan, It's you got to feel pity for them, They got a whole scheme going on in their head, and the whole thing just falls apart right at their feet. Describe the outfit that you're talking about for people who don't know what you're talking about.
Well, so I think kind of interesting that you mentioned the fact of the way he presented himself, because I think it speaks to his entire personality that he's been a chameleon of sorts, a master manipulator. He's been able to manipulate people in a number of ways. And frankly, many of our politicians, I think, are master manipulators. They're very good at somehow convincing people of something that may not be true. We see it happening with all kinds of different scenarios in that realm. But this guy ends up on the day of the murder putting on this big old goofy hat that might look like something that some of the lawn care and landscaping people might wear, but it is a major hat that extends almost out to his shoulders because he's not a really big framed guy. In addition to that, he's wearing long sleeves. He's got long pants on. This is Las Vegas. I mean, it is hot. And he's walking down the street with a bag slung over his shoulder. And he's got this big old orange reflective vest on. And, one of the things I always used to talk about with serial predators, because they do have a level of experience, organized is maybe a better word. They go into neighborhoods that they can blend into. They don't want to be picked out. And this guy missed the most important secret agent tool out of all of it, because he stood out like a sore thumb.
Yeah, just think ball cap and sunglasses. He could have maybe slipped in and out of there.
Yeah, not a ball cap even, Ed. I mean, this is a full sun hat that is round and goes out. I mean, it's got to be 2 feet in diameter to reach both sides of his shoulders as he's walking down the street.
Yeah, I was saying he should have wore a ball cap instead of this.
Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, you're right. I mean, yeah, that's exactly it. Been in shorts and riding a bike or something, nobody would have ever even looked at him.
And he did do a lot of planning, because when they did the cell phone forensics, they found pictures. He had done computer searches on his victim, Mr. Jeff Garman there, who was a Las Vegas reporter. See, what happened was as soon as Garman we found out Garman was dead, people started contacting me because I lived in Vegas for 20 years. And people that they thought the motive was his organized crime reporting. But right away, right away, everyone was saying it was Tullis because he had such a beef with him, and he was such a strange, odd character. And they spotted his car right there in the video surveillance.
Yeah. I mean, talk about, and maybe that's the only way this guy could come up with a defense, is to say somebody did exactly everything that he happened to have. Because you're right. I mean, he's taking his own vehicle to the scene. He's driving by. He clearly, after the murder, forgot something and returns again and goes running back in to get it. I suspect maybe the knife, and in the frenzy of the murder dropped it or dropped something else. But you see this incredible level of disorganization. But like you said, on the early stages, the planning wasn't disorganized. And I think that's one of the really interesting things about predators when they transition between the fantasy stage and the actual reality stage. And I don't know, do we have a minute for me to kind of explore that?
Yes, please, because that's a big thing that there's so many people nowadays that are just totally losing touch with reality. And they got a whole world going on in their head, man.
You are absolutely right. So you think about it, and this is something I used to teach when I taught profiling, was that reality is never as cool as fantasy. And we all have legitimate fantasies. I mean, for you and me, it might be to be, 6'7" and a star on an NBA team that, can dunk from the top of the keyhole or something. But for other people, especially predators, they start to fantasize about things like they have fantasy of sexual gratification or fantasy of homicide where there's violence involved, and they replay this in their mind over and over again. But the bad thing about fantasy is it's never enough, and so eventually they have to act it out. And so I suspect that that Talis went through a process of fantasy where he said, I'm going to get rid of this guy. I'm going to figure out his house. I'm going to figure out how to approach his house. And he probably role played in his mind 1,000 times how he was going to commit this homicide. The problem is the moment the assault begins, all of the plans, all of the fantasy go out the window. And if you think about even your own legitimate fantasies, maybe a romantic evening with a special someone, it always falls short of what you fantasize that it might be like. But a predator doesn't stop and say, I got to work on my relationship. A predator says, no, I'm going to satisfy my need and fulfill this fantasy. And that's when we start to see disorganization step into the crime scene. And that's how these predators get caught, is because their organized thought process, once they start acting it out and things fall apart, becomes disorganized and they make mistakes.
You know, it's incredible because you're right. And then the whole criminal defense, again, was another fantasy. And then when he's sitting there in the courtroom and he's watching the case against him, he's curling up into a ball, his hands up to his chin, like he's holding a blanket up to his chin. The shock on his face, he should have been holding up a sign saying, I am guilty.
You're absolutely right. And don't you think in the last 2 years as he sat in prison and he put together this horrible defense that he put on for himself, that he really believed he was going to convince them, like he had done time and time again in elections or in problems within the office or in his personal relationships at home, all of those things. But this time it didn't work.
What did you pick up about his relationship with his attorney, Draskovich, who's an incredibly well-respected attorney, a criminal defense attorney in Las Vegas? What did you pick up about their back and forth interactions?
You know, I have worked with many, many defense attorneys, and I really deeply respect defense attorneys and the role that they play, and they play a very crucial role. This is really important that people understand that the defense attorney's job is to ensure that the defendant gets the best trial they can get, that they get the best defense, that they are given the best opportunity to plead their case and hopefully in many cases get off. But the defense plays an incredibly important role. And I thought that Draskovich showed his hand when he finally allows Talis to testify. And I can just guarantee you that for months leading up to this, and maybe even minutes leading up to that testimony, if he could have stood on Talis's chest and held him down and kept him from testifying, he would have done it, because he knew that was not going to be productive. But he might have also recognized that it was the only chance to let the chameleon do what the chameleon has done so well throughout his career, and that is try to convince people of an untruth and find in his favor on that. But the moment that he allowed him onto the stand, you notice he didn't cross-examine him. In effect, what he was sending a message to the court was, I know that this is not true. This is my opinion, by the way. No, I know that what he's saying is not true, and I am not going to be a party to this piece of this defense.
Yeah, they even did a little presentation there where Talis only had 2 copies of his notes, and he gave one right in front of everybody. I'm handing you a copy of my notes here, Mr. Draskovich. And then he didn't have a 3rd copy for the prosecution. It was just so bizarre and unprepared.
Yeah, and how did you feel about him asking questions of the prosecution and writing notes during his testimony?
I probably would have done the same thing. But I don't know, man.
I've never seen that. I was just blown away by that whole display. And, at times I felt myself getting a little frustrated thinking, come on, judge, get a hold of this situation. And then I thought, what incredible wisdom on the judge's part to ensure that he has fewer things to appeal later down the road. He was given basically everything that he wanted. And so for him to go back and say, gosh, I was denied this and it would have made a difference, I think is going to be a hard battle to fight.
Yeah, just to back up a bit for the audience, Tellis was allowed to give a narrative testimony without his attorney asking him questions. He was allowed to go up there and narrate his own defense, which you see when a defendant is defending themselves. I've never seen it before where they've had an attorney. Have you?
Well, yes, I have seen where a defense attorney will set back when a defendant is so bent on going forward with testimony, and they'll allow them to do that because, again, the client is still the boss in this thing.
And also, an attorney cannot suborn perjury. They cannot put a defendant or a witness on the stand if they know that they're going to lie to the jury and to the court. Yeah,
and isn't that an important piece to you can misdirect, you can mislead, you can, in an investigation, you can even say something that wasn't true as part of the investigation and the interrogation. But once you're in that fact-finding courtroom, yeah, the rules are much different.
And he was remarkably unprepared.
Yes. And again, don't you think that goes back to his his personality and this belief, I can convince anyone of anything.
And if you look back at his life, he was cheating on his wife. He was dating women in the office, bullying people in the office. There was some kind of a legitimate corruption there because he was the administrator's office is where they take care of like probates and inventory property when somebody dies. And it does appear that there was some kind of corruption going on there with real estate companies buying these property undervalued and selling through straw man sales. Am I correct?
Well, that's what was coming out in the courtroom. And, of course, he really went after that one realty company as part of this entire conspiracy. And, I noticed, interestingly, I took some segments out of that testimony and I put them on a video that I published on Profiling Evil. And I actually got a sanction using the name of that company in there. So they have apparently gone back and put some copyright things on their company name and other things to prevent people from even saying their name as part of the reporting process, which, I'll let some bigger news house fight that battle. But I thought that was really interesting.
Well, just imagine if they could pull that off. They probably did get into his house and plant all that evidence on his computer.
There you go. It's good you weren't on that jury. It might have taken them longer to get out.
Yeah, what did you make of that? How could it take them that long?
It speaks to the idea that, again, in our system, what a cool system we have that one person could hold up the entire works. I mean, look what happened in that Karen Reed case up in Massachusetts and how one or two people just completely derail and they end up with a hung jury. This is why it is so important, I think, that prosecution really has their case together when they come in and that they very clearly share what the evidence is and avoid all of the noise and get right to the facts of a case that people can hone in on and say, if this happened, then the only answer is guilty. If that happened, the only answer is guilty. But, I walked away from this trial and, frankly, the Karen Reed trial thinking, I wonder if we're going to see a new realm of anarchy in the United States in particular, in our jury system, where a single individual can really become an anarchist and, for lack of a better word, a terrorist to the system by simply being belligerent and holding out.
And also, too, they must be aware that they could launch a career as a podcaster and as a guest on CourtTV, by manipulating the jury.
Yeah, there you go. Interesting.
Well, I'm really terrified too that we're going to see that, in the future elections, podcasters and Twitter people being elected to the House of Representatives, elected to Congress. With their only background being that they got a million Twitter followers.
You're absolutely right, and it's one of the things I think I try to really legitimately share what I have learned through the course of my career. I try to only respond and make or develop theories based on actionable kinds of information, maybe something that comes from an authoritative space, the police department or the district attorney. But gosh, our social media world is filled with people that that have never been in law enforcement, have never been in prosecution or the criminal justice system, that are doing true crime and saying, here's what's going on, people. And they're putting a whole lot of theory in without any fact to back it up. And I'll tell you, the seems to me that the more radical you are, the greater your numbers are. On the flip side, I mean, I'm really grateful for the people that are joining, for instance, Profiling Evil. I feel like we grow at a slow but steady pace, but they're people who are a little more analytical and thinking and willing to weigh both sides of a picture rather than become so tribal. I don't know what your feelings are about how tribal everybody's becoming, but I just think this is a little bit terrifying.
Yeah, I'm terrified too. I can't kid you at all. Because I'm down here in Florida, especially. It's you got these caravans running around here. How long until those caravans, they're waving guns out their window, man? It's right around the corner. Terrifying is a good word for this. What did you make of, and I just want to go back to, again, you're talking about the respect for facts and evidence. I used to do these shows, ranting and raving, on Friday nights years ago, about how who are these people out there doing this reporting? You have to have a reverence, a respect for the facts and the evidence of the case, not just go on your emotions or even just making things up.
Amen. Preach, brother. I often say on my show, I go back to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who penned the Sherlock Holmes series, or at least one of the books. And in one of those, he said, "It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has facts, for insensibly they spend all their time twisting the facts to meet their theory, rather than allowing the facts to unfold and then develop a theory that's based on fact." And I think responsible journalists and responsible podcasters build their theories on fact, where those who are less than responsible jump and absorb the conspiracies. And, I guess it must be more tantalizing for people. I don't know.
And they dig their heels in. I got a theory, man, and I'm digging my heels in. I don't care what. Okay, and even if the original theory is proven wrong, we'll still I can still form the rest of my theory around my original theory.
Exactly. I'm with you 100%.
What do you make of this? Because I was kind of shocked by the sentence that he can get parole in 20 years. What do you make of that?
I think it's really hard to ask a jury to provide sentencing. I think this is where I think sometimes the criminal justice system could do a better job. And I would like to see it go to more of a recommendation than a sentence, because a judge who has been in the system, who understands it, that's not overwhelmed by the emotion, they're going to be a little more apt to say, hey, this isn't working. I just, a few weeks ago, I went out with the mother of a young man who was murdered 2 years ago into the desert. I went out with her to try to look for his remains. And we were fortunate, and sadly fortunate, in finding additional remains, part of his femur bone. And while we were out there sitting on the desert, we were talking about this whole idea of what's going on and the way in which things are unfolding. And we talked about the fact that this predator that killed her son was just given a sentence just like Telus got, of 20 to life. that was something that they could only do based on the sentencing guidelines in the state of Utah. And it was incredibly frustrating for the mother of this boy who was murdered. The guy actually pointed out where he buried her son in the desert, and that's how we were out there and why we went out. The police had recovered much of his body already, but she felt like there was a little more that needed to be done. Plus, she wanted to cover up his grave so that podcasters and others wouldn't go out and do shows on his grave out in the desert, which I was just honored to go out with her and help hide and disclose that, or dispose of all the area signs that would say this is where the grave was. But at the end of the day, what it boiled down to was that the judge said, you have a 20-year minimum. You have an opportunity for parole in 20 years. But he said, I'm going to make it very clear that my recommendation to the parole board will be that you never get out of prison. I hope that behind the scenes with Tellus, that's really the message that's happening, that every year when he comes up for a parole hearing as he nears that 20-year mark, that the family of Jeff Gehrman is in there saying, wait a minute, don't forget that, yeah, he wants to go and walk his daughter down the aisle, but Jeff Gehrman will never have the opportunity to walk down any aisle. And they need to keep reminding the parole board that this guy is a predator who took a life. And just because his mother cried on the stand or his wife said, I want him to walk down the aisle with my daughter, doesn't mean this guy should get out of prison. And I hope he never does.
Yeah, premeditation, lying in wait, and a crime against the elderly, which in Florida, that's 15. If you stole $500 from somebody my age here in Florida, that's 15 years. It's a felony. So
that's yeah. No, and they deserve to have that. And you know, I'm all for forgiveness. I don't have a problem. I can forgive people, but I think there has to be consequence, and the consequence for taking a life should be a life, whether it's spent in jail or someone says this person deserves the death penalty. Those are not my dogs in the fight, but I just think there should be consequence.
Now, with your experience and training as a profiler, what do you make of him using the choice of his weapon, using a knife rather than a gun or a rifle from a distance, you know?
Yeah, you know, it's always interesting, and kind of the theories behind it are maybe the place to start at, and that is that a knife is certainly much more personal than a gun. A gun you can stand off at a distance, you can fire it, causes massive amounts of damage. But there's something about a knife. When a woman is killed with a knife, there's also some psychological aspects of defacing and other kinds of things. But in this particular case, the fact that a knife was used and the way and the manner and method in which that murder was committed really signify the amount of anger that Tellus was feeling for Gehrman, and the personal nature of this attack. He wanted it to be hands-on, and he wanted it to be up close and personal. What doesn't happen usually in these cases, and again goes back to our earlier discussion on the disorganization that eventually happens, is that killing somebody is really hard. And I've watched video inside the prison where inmates have shanked someone else. And in fact, I watched one man named Troy Kell who murdered another man in the prison, stabbed him more than 100 times. Halfway through that assault, he had to actually sit down on his hands and knees and gasp for air while he got his strength to finish killing this person. Didn't stop the anger or the assault, but it just kind of lends to this idea that it's not television, and taking a life really is an exerting kind of an effort, especially if you're going to do it hands-on in that manner.
Yeah, that's so true. And people really don't, when they're sitting home on their chair, nice and comfortable, they don't realize. But even in boxing, just try holding your fists up in front of your face for 3 minutes. Just try holding your arms up like that without throwing any punches. You know, it's not.
What an excellent analogy. Yeah. I agree. You know, and you go back to when you were in school and somebody said, just hold your arm out to the side for 60 seconds. You know.
the old PAL police athletic league would come down and teach us our gym class in the Bronx. Giving away my age now. Out of all the other cases you're working on here in profiling evil, you mentioned Karen Reed. I really know very little about that case, but it seems like the people are very passionate about that. They believe she was set up by the cops. What do you make out of that?
You know, it is a case that anyone that speaks about ends up being ultimately pushed into either an agree with law enforcement or I agree with the defense camp. And I have never seen a case where people have been so angry and so tribal, and evidence doesn't seem to matter, because the only evidence that matters are the one or two things that support the side you're on. Mm-hmm. The two sides are that Karen Reed was set up by a bunch of rogue cops, and that always I find interesting. While there is absolute evidence that there have been bad cops out there, the conspiracy theories that the prosecution, the medical examiner, the doctors in the hospital, the responding officers, the people in the home, everybody is in a conspiracy that they've secretly put together to frame this woman, seems really outrageous to me. On the flip side, you have this woman who, in the course of her defense, is able to present evidence that shows that the cops are pretty creepy guys that are sending texts that are foul, and they're doing other kinds of things that are wrong. And so all of a sudden you're tossed between the ethics of the police department and the police officers, which I think are two different things, the ethics of the police department and the ethics of individual officers, and whether in fact this woman was intoxicated and backed into and killed her boyfriend. And it's going to be interesting, because now the family of John O'Keefe, the slain Boston police officer, have filed a civil suit against Karen Reed. So not only is she facing another criminal trial because hers ended in a hung jury, but she's now facing a civil sanction where they're going after her civilly, which the standard in a civil case is much lower. If you're about 51% in agreement with one side or another, that's a ruling in a civil case, versus what we saw in Tellis's case, where it took days and days, 3 days, to get a guilty verdict because one person kept questioning what was going on in the pieces of evidence.
Does Karen Reed have money was she a homeowner? Does she have any kind of assets to go after?
That's another crazy deal. Is in this camp division that's gone on, she has raised huge amounts of money through online sources, and people who have been wronged by law enforcement or have been framed or whatever have jumped on her bandwagon and are giving her all kinds of support, including people who are good souls that just honestly believe she was set up. So yeah, she's had that. I suspect that her defense team has probably given her a pretty good deal on what's going on too, because they certainly have gotten lots of attention as a result of this.
Yeah, the same thing with this guy, Robert Draskevich, who's very well known as being sympathetic with his clients. He'll take payments, he'll work out deals with you too, if you're in trouble. So maybe she's got a deal like that going on too. Now I could just imagine when this interview goes live, how half the audience is going to come screaming at me about Mike King doesn't know what he's talking about. Karen Reed, all the Karen Reed fans are coming out in the woodwork.
Yeah, and I hope anyone listening doesn't take from what I just said as I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm just saying those are the two sides and the two camps that are fighting this thing out, and it really is interesting to me, because the thing that I'm finding so interesting is that these camps are dividing so drastically, and the line is so clear in the sand.
Yeah, they're very angry.
That nobody is even listening to the other side.
Very angry bunch. Another one of the cases I see her covering is the Delphi murders. Why don't you describe that real quick, and then we'll see what you come up with on that.
Well, so the Delphi case involves two teenage girls who were walking in Delphi, Indiana, along a historic little railroad line called the Mononhigh Bridge. And as they're walking along, they're approached by a predator. They're uncomfortable enough that one of the girls snaps a photograph of that predator on the phone, on her mobile phone, and actually even captures a recording of him telling them to go down the hill, where he eventually commits a homicide. The thing that's so interesting in this case is that law enforcement, after 5 years nearly, arrested a guy named Richard Allen and put him in jail in really terrible circumstances that I think the court finally has rectified by pulling him out of a institution where he was being held and putting him in a county jail as he prepares for trial. But along the line or along the way, as they've investigated this case and as he sat in jail, he's confessed, according to the prosecution, he's confessed to the murders 61 times. And those are recorded in many cases from jailhouse phone conversations. But in addition to that, early on in the investigation, he notified investigators, hey, I happened to be on the trail that day, just thought I should let you know. He, in many people's opinion, matches the image of the photograph that was taken on the phone, which is very granulated and not a good quality picture. We don't know if law enforcement actually has a better picture or not. But then he also, in a search of his home, law enforcement recovers a handgun that they say ballistically matches an unspent bullet recovered next to the body of one of the victims. So those are really heavy pieces of information, and forensically that's going to become a huge challenge, because some people are saying, look, the bullet was never fired, it was cycled through the weapon, that can't be a good ballistic test. And I'm saying baloney. If they can scientifically prove in court, and it's accepted, that weapon that they recovered in Richard Allen's house when they served a search warrant is the only weapon on the planet that could create a little scratch on the side of a shell casing, or on that bullet that was recovered, or on the base of the bullet where it's chambered into the
Right.
weapon, then that's forensic evidence that if accepted by the court can't be disputed. So how on earth does a guy who says, hey, I happen to be on the bridge trail the day of the murders, I happen to confess 61 times, I happen to have a weapon in my home that matches a bullet next to the victim, I happen to have all these things, but I didn't do it. Those are going to be tough things to get over, I think.
Right, because it's not just the rifling and the barrel. And sometimes you can replace the barrel too, but it's the extractor, the firing pin. These all leave distinctive characteristics, like a fingerprint.
Exactly. And what a perfect example, like a fingerprint, because that little groove inside that gun is only going to make that mark. And how on earth do those two things come together in space and time? And I think the beauty of a good criminal case is that it isn't an eyewitness and the whole case built on an eyewitness, but that it is all of the traditional forms of evidence plus behavior that say A plus B is going to equal C, whether you like it or not.
What about, I'm not following this case that closely, but there's something about some kind of a cult, Norse occult or Odin rock.
Oh, yeah. And so the defense has done a great job of bringing out this idea that Odinists are involved in this murder and that this is a conspiracy. And there might be more people involved in this murder. And I guess what I'm saying is there may be more people involved, but you can't exclude Richard Allen if those other things are in play. So I think they're smart going forward as they are. But this idea that Odinists created this thing, that it was an Odinistic ritual murder, all of that has added so much noise and intrigue to this case. And we as individuals we just don't understand these kinds of horrors, and we want an explanation. And something like this could be an explanation, that there's cults out there secretly committing murder. And, on one night on Court TV, I was asked to respond to, we haven't seen the pictures of the crime scene, but I was asked to respond to what people described as branches that were laying on the victims in what could appear to be an odinistic sign. And I remember I sent a photograph in, and I said, I'd like you to put this picture up. And while I was talking, I said, I want you to look at this photograph. And they put up a picture, and it was a picture of the woods, and there were trees with tree branches hanging over the top of other tree branches. And I said, this photograph came from a program on Bigfoot. And the Bigfoot examiners said this is absolute proof that Bigfoot exists because of the way these branches are laying on top of each other. I said, now, I talked to a forester and an arborist who said that's exactly what a forest looks like if the wind's been blowing or the trees are getting old. And so it boiled down, in my opinion, when you think about these odinistic signs, they absolutely have to be explored, investigated, and either included in the investigation or excluded. But I always go back to do you remember the Tim Allen movie, the Santa Claus?
Sure.
He made a thing that I think is probably one of the most brilliant investigative tips I've ever heard. And he said, as the little girl said to him, you've got to see in order to believe something. And he said, no, sometimes believing is seeing.
That's deep, man. That's deep. And I guess now the defense can maybe call in Bigfoot as an alternative.
There you go. And you know what? Isn't that the job of the defense anyway, to create doubt and get one person to just say, I don't know, I've always believed in Bigfoot.
Yeah. So Mike King, profilingevil.com. Let me ask you a question. In your experience in law enforcement over the years, I've seen so many cases. I think back to this little boy that was murdered in Las Vegas, and his mother and the mother's boyfriend tortured this little boy, and they both went to prison, the mother and the boyfriend. But the grandmother was in that house too and saw this torture, did nothing to stop it. What is it that makes the cops draw the line and arrest certain people and let other people in that same room go?
We actually had this discussion. Maybe people could go back and listen when we talked about the Deceived book and the Zion Society. But we talked about this idea that we literally we put 12 people in prison in the Zion Society case. There were more than 4,000 rapes of children. But after 2 years of going through the criminal justice system and forcing children to testify over and again, we made a conscious decision about what do we do about some of these other people that should be prosecuted, but they're lesser charges, or they at what point do we say enough is enough? And today, 30 years later with the Zion Society, I still look back and think, I wish we would have continued, because those children deserved the justice of everyone who offended them. But sometimes you just got to draw the line. And we see that happen on cases where criminals have multiple offenses, maybe a serial predator in multiple states. Robert Ben Rhodes would be a great example, who some people believe killed as many as 30 people, or 300 people, I mean. Rhodes is only serving a death sentence or a life sentence for one of those. Is there really value in going back and doing all those cases and having the expense when 25,000 murders are occurring every year in our country, and we're not even keeping up on what we've got, let alone going back and doing ones where we've guaranteed somebody's not getting out of jail? So those are tough questions that I'm glad I don't have to answer, because people who are victimized deserve justice, and sometimes it doesn't come.
So I'm looking here at profilingevil.com, and one of your reports here is Babyland, FLDS Infant Cemetery. My God, what could that be about?
Oh, you know what? I hope people will go and look at that, because during my career, I spent a great deal of time investigating closed societies, polygamy, and other kinds of cults. One of those was the Warren Jeffs case, which you're very familiar with. He ended up going to prison in Texas for sexually assaulting children. He was a polygamist who had a huge group, over 10,000 members. They are spread all across the country and into Canada. And during my career, I was doing everything I could to investigate that cult. They were called the FLDS, if that rings a bell. And that they were fundamental Latter-day Saints. So if you think back in the polygamy world, the Latter-day Saint Church in the 1890s were practicing polygamy, but they said in the 1890s, because of federal law and the desire to become a state, they said we're going to ban polygamy and no longer practice polygamy. And so that came out as a rule, and members of the Latter-day Saint faith who wouldn't stop practicing polygamy were excommunicated from the church and started these fundamentalist movements, one of which was the FLDS, Fundamental Latter-day Saint Church, not to be confused with the mainstream Latter-day Saint Church, but I think it oftentimes is. But I spent a lot of years down in that community, and every time I would go in, very closed community, could never get any answers. I was always troubled by a little plot of ground where I heard more than 250 babies were buried inside that cemetery. Most of those, if not all of those, never had birth certificates and never had a death certificate. And I was incensed throughout my entire career. I could never get state human health services to go back and look at it, or anyone else, because they were cases dating back to the 1950s. And I believed these babies deserve to be known and have a place on the map. So in January of this year, when I retired, I went down and I spent a month in the polygamous community. And I'll tell you what, it was not a real comfortable time, because most of those people down there hate my guts because of what I did over the years as an investigator. But I flew that plot of ground with my drone. I created a high-resolution map. I identified every single grave, and I found 200 graves out of the 250. And most of those, if you go and look at that map, you'll see there's a little stone or a piece of wood with a baby Jessup name on it or something like that, but no other information. And I created that map in hopes that those who have fled polygamy might reach back and say, hey, that was my child, and I want you to know a little more about him. And I wanted them to be remembered. I didn't want them just forgotten because the polygamous community didn't think it was important enough to remember them. And so I created that map. There were a lot of people that were very unhappy about that. But since, I've had a number of expatriates of the polygamy community who have reached out and shared stories about their kids, and I've started to add those to the map as they come in. And thank you for noticing that. I hope that people will go and look at that story map where I talk about those babies and give them an example, or they can go in and look at the physical map and zoom in on those tombstones and see and learn about those little tykes that never were given a chance. Most of those died within 7 days of birth.
Just imagine, because so many of these, the mothers were probably like 12, 13 years old in these cases, given to some 60-year-old man, and then you have a premature baby, and it's just what a mess.
Yeah, terrible situation. And if people are interested in learning more about that polygamy thing, I've done an entire 13-episode podcast on that community, the history of it, the things that I did over the years, including, and you're not going to want to miss this, Ed, sometime go in and watch my video on going inside the secret caves, because all my career I heard about secret caves that were hidden in the hillside where the polygamists were stockpiling explosives and weapons in preparation for the end of the world. And my arch enemy, a guy named Willie Jessup, who was the bodyguard to the FLDS prophets, years after Warren Jeffs went to prison, I finally, late last year, went down and said, you and I are going to lunch. And it was not a very friendly meeting, but we ended up spending 8 hours together. And the guys that were formerly mortal enemies found some common ground to talk. And at the end of that visit, I said, there's one place I want to see, and that is the secret caves. And he said, they don't exist. And I said, baloney, and I left. And about 4 months later, he said, why don't you come down? He said he wanted me to spend the night in the home that he built for Warren Jeffs, an 87-bedroom home for all of Warren Jeffs' wives. And he said, I'll let you stay in the house alone. You've always wanted to get inside. And I thought, I'm going to take him up on that. So I did a live from inside of the home that night. And then the next morning at 6 o'clock in the morning, one of his polygamous wives knocked on my door. And I opened the door, and she said, here's a key to the cave. Here's the instructions of where the cave is. Willie won't go in with you, but you're welcome to film it. And I go inside and I walk through this thing that had been a ghost story for decades. And I include that on my podcast. So kind of a cool thing to go see. The
whole
caves.
Nother planet going on. We've been talking to Mike King, profilingevil.com. Check that out. And when you want to find his books, it's kind of hard to find because there's a few Mike Kings out there that are authors. And I think this Mike King doesn't want anything to do with those other Mike Kings. But look for Deceived, an investigative memoir of the Zion Society, and then you click on that name there, Michael R. King, you come up with his other book, which is She Knew No Fear, the true story of pioneer Jane McKechnie, Walton's incredible journey and untimely death. Michael King, thank you so much, my friend. Great, great, great stuff. I'd love to have you come back soon and talk about that, what was that, Doomsday, Daybells, that bunch there.
Always willing to come back, Ed. Love being on with you, and thank you so much for all you've contributed in bringing stuff to light.
Thank you, sir. Good night.